my dear friends, I wanted to have 3 cups of tea with you and see if this works. And talk a bit about Ukrainian civil society. I'm going to stop fidgeting with the mic. Talk a bit about Russian civil society. And then talk about Western civil society. I think it's not gonna fall. You're gonna fall. It's not gonna fall. And I don't know if this will work, but let's give it a bit of a go. I mean, so what do we feel looking in from the outside that we can say to help ourselves just grasp a little bit the parameters of what's going on with Ukrainian civil society? Well, there is a kind of a burst of Ukrainian civil society in 2014, 2015, and then it doesn't really go very well and go enough places. And then there is a kind of extraordinary reignition of Ukrainian civil society now under the extreme conditions of the war. And just one deeply moving expression of it is the extraordinary number of people who are systematically volunteering all over the country to support the sustenance of the state, to support the sustenance of the military, to gather funds for little gadgets for Ukrainian soldiers and so on. So it's an extraordinary kind of engagement and coming together that is, in a way, more patriotic than it is nationalistic, according to distinction I sort of tried to impose on some of you earlier. We don't need to do anything about that distinction, but let's just say that the way Ukrainians are thinking about belonging in Ukraine is about a society that has strong democratic features, a society that includes everybody, and a society that bases the belonging on a kind of civic bond that is fast unifying all Ukrainian citizens. Now, what is the future prospect of this extraordinary evolution of civil society in Ukraine? And how does Ukraine take the next steps if things go well in a way that's constructive and not destructive, And this is really, 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 really difficult. I mean, just think about the fact that Ukraine is being attacked by a neighbor that has completely lost the plot with its politics. I mean, it's a country that's, been losing the plot for a very, very long time. And that's culminated in an extraordinary kind of political collapse that hasn't yet culminated necessarily. We need to see where it's going to go. So they've got this insane neighbor attacking them. I mean, I'm speaking in a kind of pub way. Then they've got a situation where they barely had any civil society by Western standards up until a few weeks ago, a few months ago. And then they've got a West that is very far from its place of stability and clarity of identity that it had 20 years ago. You've got a West that's divided. You've got a West that is experiencing very toxic culture wars and is experiencing a destabilization of democratic institutions and a kind of seemingly irreversible decline in citizen trust in any kind of public institutions. So Ukraine doesn't have a very clear and convincing Western model to turn to that is flourishing and that can inspire them. In fact, what's happening is that this guy, Zelensky, who wasn't a remarkable leader before the war, to say the least, and can be criticized in all kinds of ways for all kinds of faults and limitations. But this guy came together, excelled under the extreme conditions of the Russian invasion, and he's now a model for all the European leaders and the European citizens. Even though he's a leader of a country that barely had any political sense of itself just a few months ago. There is always then, of course, this extraordinary feeling of precarity and vulnerability that Ukraine feels, because it's completely dependent on the conversation that the West is having with itself, A, about what it is, and B, about how it feels about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The West is having a conversation about what it is, in the sense that Europe isn't clear whether all the European countries are as much Europe as anything else. So you've got the Baltics, you've got the Poles, you've got all the East European states, and we're saying they are part of Europe. But then there's another story that says they're kind of part of Europe, but they're the sort of Class B European countries, and they don't really represent Europe like Class A European countries do, like Germany and France. And Europe is having a conversation with itself about this. We already discussed that this very much affects questions like, well, if the Poles feel that they're directly threatened by Russia, for instance, can we say that Europe is directly threatened by Russia, or can we say that it's a Polish problem? Europe hasn't decided this. And then the West is always in the process of exploration and stabilization about what it wants to do with this war. I mean, there are clear parameters established now, but Ukraine is living permanently in fear that something will change the next day. And that's partly why some of these hyperventilated statements are coming out of Ukraine about the particular visa policies European countries should adopt and so on. Ukraine's mission is to try to avoid the collapse of European and American unity, and, if possible, encourage the consolidation of that unity and the clarification of their purpose. It's difficult to be, and here I'm going to use that word in a positive sense, if you like, it's difficult to be somebody else's proxy. In the next Q&A, I'll explain why I choose to use that word, even though folks who have a picture of the war that we completely reject also use that term. But I think it's important for about 5 different reasons for me to use that word, and they're all to do with how I talk with you about what's going on. So it's not a lazy word to use. Let me just give you one sort of bit of the 5, and that's that I always want to sort of encourage you to keep unforgetting that the United States national interests and the national interests of Ukraine overlap until they don't. And that the fundamental vision of the United States here is that its goals aren't just that Ukraine wins. Its goals are strategic goals vis-a-vis the place of Russia in the world, the kind of Russia, that we've got now. So this is very, very difficult, that you feel this extraordinary existential precarity, because, quite frankly, the internal politics of this major superpower are going to decide what happens to you. And that's a very stressful situation in which to be on top of the trauma of war and destruction and death and injury and massacre and radical unsafety and vulnerability. So, all of these extreme events have, on the one hand, consolidated a kind of civic coming together, but on the other hand, it's not clear that that's the best environment in which to sort of civically develop yourself as a country in a sustainable way. So what we want to then say is that Ukraine's conversation about what it means for Ukraine to win the war has to break down into two. And the first bit is that Ukraine hopefully wins the war on its own terms. You can't win the war by marching on Moscow, but that means defending yourself to a reasonable extent and maintaining your integrity to a reasonable extent against Russia by the time some kind of negotiation occurs. Can't negotiate now. Why? Because Russia is on a pattern of escalation. Russia still wants Kiev. Russia still wants to break down NATO. So we can forget about the idea that Russia has delimited interests. Russia does not have delimited interests. It's whatever it is, August 2022, Putin wants Kiev. I'm going to be very clear about this. Putin wants Kiev. If he can't have Kiev militarily, he wants Kiev in some kind of indirect way in the next few years. So that's one of the reasons why the let's negotiate now argument breaks down. But eventually all wars end in negotiation. And what's important for Ukraine is that there is the winning, or the winning in quote marks, and then there is the other kind of winning, which is how Ukraine moves forward from this. And you want many, many different flowers to bloom when it comes to Ukrainian civil society. So one of the things that I would be very impressed about observing is if Ukraine continued to cultivate a plurality of voices that are encouraging the country to talk to itself, voices with a national reach, but no voice can reach everybody. So we need a plurality of voices. Ukraine is not a tiny country in population. And even now, with so many people forced out, it's still not a tiny country in terms of population. But if you look at the voices in Ukraine that help the country talk to itself, they're a tiny fraction of what you would find, let us say, in the UK or in France. And that needs to grow. And there is something very interesting that we could reach here as a point for future exploration. And it is sort of brought out in a way by some of the things that Andrei Baumeister has been saying. And he's a Ukrainian philosopher and a public intellectual who is doing a wonderful job of helping Ukraine speak to itself. And he himself actually is a kind of measured conservative, but he is not really imposing that on the kind of conversation he is having with the country at the moment at all. And one of the things that he has pointed to is the very suspicious reaction that at the moment Ukrainian public discourse is prone to in response to various authoritative pronouncements from overseas. And one of the examples Baumeister gives is the Pope making pronouncements about the war that could potentially be questioned. And I don't actually know what Andrei thinks here. But I suspect that where he is going is that a country with a stronger sense of self wouldn't react like this. That a country with a stronger sense of a constructive, positive conversation with itself about its self-image wouldn't react like this. And I would perhaps add the examples of many elements of Ukrainian public discourse overreacting to what are frankly quite straightforwardly 2+2 quite radical Russian anti-regime oppositional discourse, typically now had by Russians who are overseas because they've all been declared foreign agents. So one of the things that you can observe is the criticism in Ukraine of Maxim Katz, who is a Russian sort of political consultant, political strategist, but now just a content maker on YouTube. He's got a very big team. They release a video every day in Russian. And I mean, basically, he's as anti-Putin as it gets. But nevertheless, he's gotten into a lot of trouble, not so much for what he says in his videos, but for random bits of, statement that he's made on Twitter in 2015, and so these sorts of things that resemble the political correctness excesses in the West are being mirrored in the way Ukrainians are responding to these Russians who are oppositional, but who many in Ukrainian public discourse feel a kind of inadvertently mirroring some aspects of Russian propaganda. And this is interesting that Andrei Baumeister, who is a hugely prominent Ukrainian public intellectual, is taking things in a direction he's worrying about. He's worrying about Ukraine's positive, constructive conversation with itself over the years to come. So let's try to say a little bit about Russian civil society, but it's hard because we're talking about very fragile, promising momentum in Ukraine, and we're talking about a kind of descent into a subterranean inferno in Russian civil society. The last time Russian civil society looked promising was really toward the end stages of the communist period and maybe around the transition. And before that, in the 1910s. And it's really important that we don't conflate the Russia of the 1910s and the late 19th century with communist Russia that followed. There were many very healthy and very positive potentialities in the Russia of the 1910s, And something I say personally is, if you listen to Russians in public life who were already adults before the revolution, like Kerensky, for example, you feel that you're listening to a person completely unburdened by the extraordinary trauma and corrosiveness of all of the imprints that the Soviet period left on that culture. But anyway, so we've already talked about the problem that the Russians have, that they have nowhere to take their opposition to the war, which means that only a small percentage of the population are really sitting there and thinking this war is a catastrophe, this war is a catastrophe. The others are trying to evade the issue. But if they had somewhere to go with protest, for example, that could potentially make some kind of difference, then you'd see huge numbers of Russians coming out against the war. So we've got this problem of extraordinary political demobilization and passivity. And now that's complemented by a repressive apparatus whereby you just can't do anything, really. Not really, really. And then you've got the situation where Russia risks descending further into a totalitarian direction. I mean, people are already worried about, neighbors grassing up on each other to the regime. And Russians are sitting and they're watching how far this will escalate. So where is the most promising Russian oppositional political discourse happening. Well, now it's happening overseas. I don't think I can talk to you at this point about what the Russian opposition figures who are in the West are currently doing. Because it would be difficult for me to remain polite and respectful. So I can say that while I am enormously impressed by the work of so many Russian thinkers and Russian oppositional academics who are now in the West, there's room for improvement when it comes to aspiring Russian political figures who are out in the West. Let me just mention one of the problems that's happening, and that's that they are very vulnerable, to put it mildly, to being caught up in a kind of discourse of moral outrage about what the Putin regime is doing, without there being much politics in what they say. And what their overriding goal should be to precisely do everything in their power to facilitate today and in the future mechanisms for Russia to talk to itself. Just what we were discussing about Ukraine earlier, that Ukraine is doing, but is doing in a fragile and precarious way under extreme circumstances. Russia needs to explore talking to itself politically. Politics needs to begin happening in Russia at some point. It's obstructed now. And the opposition need to do what they can to prepare Russia for that, and of course to bring it about too. And at the moment, there's enormous room for improvement. And one of the key areas for improvement is politics. We want some more politics from the Russian opposition leaders. And I'll try to offer critique at some point, but I don't want to sound too eviscerating because this is fresh and there's always indeed room to improve. But at the moment, because I haven't thought about it, I'll be quite mean. So we're going to need to allow me some time to put together something constructive to say about how I see the role of the opposition. A few folks have asked me what I think, or what indeed oppositional Russians in Europe think about the visa discourse. And let's just be abstract about this and not refer to any specific proposals, but say that there are proposals to get rid of tourist visas for Russians in Europe. And then there are ever wider proposals, including getting rid of all Russians in Europe and sending them back. Or at least that's part of public discourse in some countries. Well, let me just make one observation about it from the point of view of, if you like, a political philosopher who has thought about tyrannical regimes from the 1600s to today. And that leads me to conclude that the prudential component of this conversation that goes like this: we've got to get the oppositional Russians inside Russia so that Russia changes, is complete nonsense. I mean, it's not even a starter. And a lot of politicians in the Baltics are being indulged when they use that kind of argument, but that argument has not really any serious basis in reality. In other words, it is certainly sincerely believed by a lot of people, but the truth is just sort of squiggles and bits of fluff that are there to masquerade a moral position, a moral outrage, because that political argument it's not real. That's my view strongly. There is something really unlovely, aesthetically and ethically, about Russia bombing Ukraine and Russians walking around Western countries sipping lattes and cappuccinos on tourism trips. So you've got to think about that. But as always with issues of immigration, you got to look at the reality on the ground and not at the proposals. And what you don't want is sort of ideal language, which says, yes, we get rid of the tourist stuff, but we do humanitarian visas, but a practice where nothing of the kind is happening. Nothing of the kind is happening. And you've got not just some tourism problems, tourist visa problems, and not all of these are actually people drinking cappuccinos. I mean, you've got Russian families in European countries, you've got Russian families in the Baltics, in abundance, and you're going to have a situation where relatives now can't see each other. But that's just the tourist stuff. The stuff that is clearly worrying a lot of oppositional Russians in Europe is basically that even academics who've jumped over the border, whose social media is full of oppositional discourse, are not feeling safe, and probably not feeling safe for good reason in some places. And here we want to be very, very clear. It's not just that it's not effective to sort of stuff Russians into Russia so that it sort of implodes and the revolution occurs. That's not a real story. But we also got to be realistic that there are probably over half a dozen criminal articles and that one could face. And so you are effectively sending people into a prison sentence if you are sending non-tourist Russians who are now working in European countries, if you're kicking them out, either intentionally or inadvertently, because there are faults in the bureaucracy or faults in the system. So you've got to be very, very clear what we're sending people into. And as one exiled Russian academic said, he said, I'm noticing a curious sort of pattern that the people who are tending toward the view that we should just send all Russians back are the very same people that call Russia a fascist society. And we've talked about how many fascist elements are developing in Russia. And there's always a question about whether these labels are constructive or useless. We could just talk about degrees of authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and so on. But what that particular academic said is quite obvious. In other words, you simply don't get to call Russia a fascist country and then recommend that Russians are sent back into it. That just does not add up in terms of any kind of reasonable understanding by Europeans of their own values. So if you were to take some action on all of this stuff of Russians going around Europe, my suggestion actually would be not to start with Russians who are getting some kind of visas, even tourist visas, but potentially to start with Russians who already have a right to be staying in Europe, settled in Europe. And we've got to look at how many of those have direct or formal links with the Putin regime. We've got to be very rigorous about this, but the truth is there's a heck of a lot of Russians who have links to the Putin regime who are all over Europe. And if we're going to start anywhere, I think that's a reasonable place to start is exploring what the deal is with those and putting in place some stringent criteria to look at saying, hey, I'm sorry, you're not going to be here if you're tied with this regime. I want to share with you a couple of stats that sort of tell us about how far Russians are kind of aware of what's going on, even though they're stuck in this both tyrannical but then also radically depoliticized dynamic. And the stats are about antidepressant use. So, according to TASS, who are saying this information comes from the Center for the Development of Advanced Technologies in Russia, there's been a 60% rise in 2022 in the use of antidepressants in Russia, basically since the war. And that's a 113% rise in the use of sertraline, which is Zoloft, and 90% rise in the use of fluoxetine, which is Prozac, and a 79% rise in the use of escitalopram, which is Lexapro or Cipralex. And the biggest rises in the use of antidepressants are in Moscow and in Petersburg. And then there are some areas where there is the lowest increase or no increase at all, and one of those is Chechnya. So I just wanted to share these stats with you because they do tell us a little bit about, how much Russians realize that something really, really off is going on, as much as they try to look away.